This
Started.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jessica Enix and I'm with the ACIL staff and I would like to welcome you to today's presentation, Core HR Systems for Proper Onboarding. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few points of protocol so that you'll get the most out of your webinar experience. Remember, you are listening to the webinar via a conference service. If you are disconnected, repeat the steps that were given to you by the registration email. In order to reduce background noise, please remain on mute throughout the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box. A chat icon is located on the top right-hand side of your screen. The presenter will address questions as they become available or at the conclusion of the webinar. Please note that today's program is being recorded and will be available on the ACIL website at the end of the day today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Ms. Jamie Hasty. Jamie Hasty is a Vice President with SESCO Management Consultants, Bristol, Tennessee, and Richmond, Virginia. Jamie graduated from East Tennessee State University with a BBA in Human Resources Management. Her professional affiliations include the Society for Human Resource Management and various state chambers of commerce. Jamie is a generalist consultant in all areas of human resource management with specialties in affirmative action, policy development, wage and hour accounting, employment regulation compliance, training and development, compensation and performance management systems, client representation with state and federal agencies like the Department of Labor, employee satisfaction assessments, executive screening and placement, and general human resources consulting. The variety of client engagements and daily interaction over the course of Jamie's career enables her to provide practical, helpful, and legal advice and support to clients in all industries throughout the country. She regularly conducts management training programs for clients and serves as a guest speaker for state and national associations and chambers of commerce. Jamie is a certified trainer for Vital Learning Corporation and SESCO Leadership Institute. She is also a John C. Maxwell coach, trainer, teacher, and speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Jamie Hasty.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I think this is probably one of my more favorite topics to kind of take it back to some of the basics. Whether you are a smaller lab or you are a very large multi-state, multi-site lab, basics are always important, right? So today we're going to talk about the core HR systems for one, the HR function, but two, proper onboarding. And these are things that we look for when we are working with our clients or auditing our clients, their total HR function. As a reminder, SESCO has a relationship with ACIL where members have free telephone and email access. So feel free to use that member benefit, please. I know we speak with many of you all, and we very much appreciate that. But we would love to hear from those who we don't talk to that often. So kind of the game plan for today is we're going to first and foremost start with what should be in the personnel file, and let's talk records retention. Then we're going to roll into proper onboarding for new hires. And then talk a little bit more about the employee handbook as a critical HR system. As Jessica mentioned, feel free to use the chat feature to ask Q&A. We will answer those as best we can as we go along. And, you know, there is no such thing as a silly question, so please feel free to ask it. So when I'm working with clients, especially from an audit perspective, I actually will look at the personnel files. What's in it, what's missing, what forms are being used, what needs to be tweaked. And some of that is going to be dictated by federal law, and then other things are going to be very state specific, right? So just as a general reminder, you should have three types of personnel files. The first one should be your general personnel file. That's where your application, job description, all of the normal onboarding employment documents go, right? Then you need to have a separate medical file. That separate medical file must be in a separate drawer under lock and key. Now, if you're using electronic files, it needs to be, again, still separated out from all of the other electronic folders under password protection, backed up. It cannot have ongoing open access through your server or HIRS system. And then the third type of file that you should have is for your I-9s. We do not like the I-9s in the general personnel file because if those files are ever audited or subpoenaed, it is the theory of discovery. If the I-9 is incorrect, that other agency or that governing body may, notify the USCIS that, you have some I-9 issues, and those penalties can creep up on you very quickly. But we'll talk more about all that. So overall, generally thinking, I want to see 3 different types of files. And when I start with the general personnel files, the first thing I'm looking for is an application of employment. Now, that application is going to vary depending on what state you are operating in. Certain states have requirements that you cannot ask about conviction history before you get into the, new hire process, or you have to get through the second round of interview before you can ask about those things. So state law does drive some of these applications. SESCO obviously has compliant applications for every state. So if you need a new one, let me know. Be happy to send that over to you. But we're looking for EEO statements, your equal employment opportunity. That should be on your application. We're looking for history of employment, dates. Some applications are allowed to ask what the compensation history is. What was your hourly rate or salary? What are you looking for? There are many, many states that are moving away from that being permissible. So again, state law we need to comply with as well. Professional references. Every application should also have what I refer to as an active period. Generally, there are statements on the back where they're signing, look, I attest that this is true and accurate information. There may be some releases. I understand that the company is an equal opportunity employer, et cetera, et cetera. But with that active period, what it does is it basically says, look, this application will remain on file active for the next blank amount of days. Generally, we see anywhere from 30 to 90 days. You could certainly do 120 if you really wanted to. After that time frame has passed, in order to be considered for employment, you must reapply. So the active period really is there to protect the organization from applications being quote unquote active for their entirety. And why is that important? Because federal law requires that any application for employment that we receive must be maintained for at least 12 months after we have received it. So if you're getting applications for employment while you have an open position, and let's say you opened it up last month in July, but you found your candidate, hallelujah, because it's a tough market out there. You found your person and you're getting ready to close the opening. Any of those applications, and quite frankly, the resumes as well, you have to have stored somewhere for the next 12 months. After that, you can purge them. So what we don't want to have happen with an active period is that application remains open forever and ever and ever. We've seen situations throughout the years where individuals who were not hired came back and made legal complaints that they weren't hired for a new job that they actually technically didn't apply for, and that the company discriminated against them. And their premise was, well, my application never expired. I should have been considered. I applied. So make sure you have an active period. Again, we talked about conviction history. Just a little note on that. If you are in a state that is permissible to ask about convictions, again, we're talking about convictions, not arrests. And not all convictions are going to disqualify applicants from being gainfully employed. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has opinion letters and gone on record that in order for a conviction to be used in the hiring decision or in the employment decision altogether, that conviction somehow needs to directly relate to or prohibit that person from performing the essential functions of the job. So case in point, if I was going to be driving a company vehicle because I'm a salesperson and I had 3 DUIs on my record, which for whatever it's worth, I do not. Those convictions could prohibit me from being in an outside sales position because it directly relates to my essential function of driving, plus driving a company vehicle, right? So, you have to be mindful of the conviction history and making sure that A, we can ask it in the first place, and B, that we're using that information appropriately. Now, what's important to note is when I audit client files, it is not unusual for me to find either applications that have not been completely filled out and or not signed by the individual. You want to make sure that the new hire is signing the application, because once it is signed, it becomes a legal document. If there is misrepresentation within that document and that information comes to light, you can move forward with termination for falsification of the application. Okay. So you want to make sure it's complete, that they, filled out every section they were supposed to, that they signed release, that you have an active period, and that they've signed and dated the application. Okay. The next thing that I look for is what we call our notice to applicants, and that's for purposes of Americans with Disabilities Act as amended. So the notice to ADA, if you have 15 or more employees, you're covered by ADA on a federal level. Now, if you are a smaller organization, you're also going to want to check with, or SESCO can check with your particular state, because every state does have their own version of equal employment opportunity, which is going to cover Disabilities Act. Okay. So, with your notice to applicants, that's basically just an additional form or addendum. It's language. Again, we can get you a copy of one. And it basically is just letting the individual know, hey, if you have a need for a reasonable accommodation due to a physical or mental disability during this screening, hiring, onboarding process, you need to notify the office manager, the HR person, whomever it may be. And they sign and acknowledge that. That's a requirement under federal law as well. Okay. Other things that we're looking for would be obviously a copy of the resume or the curriculum vitae, interview notes. In a perfect world, I would prefer to see behavioral-based interview guides. Tell me about a time when, describe to me how you handled this, those sorts of things. We're looking for open-ended behavioral-based guides that are tailored to the position that they're hiring for. Those interview notes can justify why we hired somebody or declined to hire somebody. So we want to see that in the file as well. It's also really, really important. Please never write on the application or the resume. Again, those things are discoverable. We had a situation a couple of years ago where a client had interviewed 2 individuals and had written little generalizations or reminders on the resume about cars. They were talking about cars for whatever reason, and the female said, either I drive or I like the Chevy Tahoe. So he wrote soccer mom on the, Tahoe/soccer mom on the resume. And then the other individual that they were, interviewing, they wrote, business class sedan, whatever it was. Long story short, the female individual filed a charge of discrimination. She didn't get hired, but she saw them write on her application and her resume and knew that he had written, the hiring manager had written those things. So her assumption was, well, you didn't hire me because I'm a mom and I'm female. In reality, they never even discussed children, which is also a no-no in screening and hiring. But please make sure you don't write on the application or resume. Again, it's discoverable. And that's why you have interview guides. At the very least, put it on a sticky note, something that can be removed if needed, if something inappropriate, whether it was on purpose or not, was written down. Now, if you are in specific industries, for example, automotive, which we know we're not, but if you have any sort of bonus or commission pay plan, particularly for your salespeople or your leadership team, if they're getting some sort of performance bonus, we're going to want to see a copy of that compensation pay plan. What's the salary or hourly rate? What are they eligible for? How is that going to be calculated? And I'm looking for them to also sign and date that, as well as the manager to sign and date as well, so that we don't get into a situation where an employee is questioning, well, how is this bonus calculated? Because your pay plan was part of the personnel file and they signed and acknowledged it. Some states require employment letters, offers of employment letters. Even if your state does not, it is always best practice to do an offer letter of employment with their title, rate of pay, when are they going to start, what benefits are they eligible for, what supervisor do they report to, and then documents that they need to bring for the first day of employment. And we'll talk more about the I-9 here shortly. I'm also looking for professional certifications, training certificates. If I'm hiring a CPA for the accounting office, I want a copy of that designation. You're also going to have a lot of pre-employment authorizations and disclosures. It is always best practice to run background checks. Again, those need to be done post-contingent job offer. EEOC says none of these pre-employment checks, references, drug testing, background, credit, personality profiles, none of that should be done before a verbal or a written contingent offer of employment is on the table. Okay. And even then, you need signed authorizations for each type of check to conduct. Now, common misconception is that, the background or the credit check can't go in the general personnel file because it's got sensitive or confidential information. And that is incorrect. It absolutely can go in the general personnel file. It should be there. What we're looking for is the authorizations, the appropriate disclosures, along with a copy of the findings. So I'm looking for the background or credit authorization along with a copy of the results. I'm looking for a reference release as well as a copy of what the reference said. Now, the only exception to this rule is obviously going to be drug testing. Why? Because drug testing results are considered medical. So what I'm looking for in the general file is that, yes, we got authorization to conduct the drug test, but the actual copy of the drug test results goes in the medical file. It's the only pre-employment authorization or pre-employment check, rather, that will not stay with the authorization form. Okay. The next thing that I'm looking for is a copy of a job description. The more qualitative and quantitatively written those job descriptions are, the better off everybody is for a number of reasons. But at the very least, make sure it talks about your KSAs, your knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for the job. I'm looking for essential and non-essential functions. I'm looking for disclaimers that the company reserves the right to modify or edit this job description based on company need. And then I'm also looking for the employees that have signed and dated the document. Kind of going back a little bit to when we talked about interview guides. So the interview questions should be coming directly off of the job description based on what the position requires. If we're looking at customer service or teamwork, tell me about a time when, you were unable to deal with an irate customer. What happened? What did you learn from it, etc. Now tell me a time about when you were successful in, turning around an irate customer. But that customer service piece should be listed in the job description as one of the core functions, the core responsibilities. Effectively communicates with customers and engages in appropriate customer service, et cetera, et cetera. So with job descriptions in the Americans with Disabilities Act, the job description is important, not just from a screening and hiring standpoint, but again, most everybody is going to be covered underneath ADA. And so what happens when somebody has a physical or a mental disability that impacts their ability to perform a major life activity or a function, we have to, as the employer, explore reasonable accommodations, right? And so in that job description, there should also be what I call the ADA form that's either included in it, attached to the back, somewhere in that job description document, we have a description of the physical, environmental, sensory requirements of the job. That is also why I want you to sort and have clearly designated which functions of the job are essential versus which ones are non-essential. Essential functions, the easiest way I can describe that is, why does the position exist? The majority of my time is going to be spent doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, those things should be denoted as essential. So with ADA, we want to know how much weight are they required to lift? How much pushing, pulling, bending, stooping are they doing? What sort of hazards are they exposed to in the environment or on the job? Are they required to wear safety equipment? Those sorts of things. Why? Because if we get into a situation where we need to explore a reasonable accommodation, that job description should be the first thing that the manager and the human resources individual is going to, okay? Also, if we have to get a fitness for duty exam done by the doctor or get some sort of medical certification, that job description is going to go to the doctor, and the doctor needs to be able to read it and understand, oh, Jamie, I can't clear you for your back, or I need to give you restrictions because this job description says you have to be able to independently lift 50 pounds consistently day in and day out. But, your pinched nerve isn't going to allow you to do that. Okay. So the employer has the judgment to determine which functions are essential and non-essential. You want to make sure that this piece is included in the job description because it's important when we are advertising or interviewing applicants to be able to also show them this piece and say, here's the job description. Can you meet these requirements with or without an accommodation? Yes or no. That's all we need. Okay. And it's also going to help us document the amount of time spent performing each job function. The other things that we're looking for in the general personnel file are obviously tax forms, definitely federal tax forms. If you are operating in a state that requires income taxes, state income taxes, we're looking for that form as well. We're also going to be looking for new hire reporting. There are a lot of employers that still do not have any idea that new hire reporting happens or needs to happen, and it's been around since the late 80s, early 90s. But every employer in every state must report every new hire to the state within 21 days from when they are hired. That is how the state tracks wage garnishments for purposes of tax liens, court garnishments for child support, that sort of thing. most people are now, using automated payroll systems, and most of the time the payroll system will do that for you, or your HIRS system will do that for you. But that all being said, A, we need to verify it's being done, and B, you're supposed to have copies of every submission. That copy should be in the general personnel file. At the very least, it needs to be printed. The submission confirmation needs to be printed and stored in a new hire reporting folder that you want to keep separate. That's fine too. It's not the end of the world. But make sure that you're doing your new hire reporting. Every file should also have a copy of your employee handbook receipt from when they signed and dated it at the time of hire, as well as any time that handbook is updated, a new handbook receipt needs to be signed. Okay. And then there are any other pre-employment checks per industry or state regulation. If you have DOT drivers, certainly you're going to have a separate DOT clearance folder for those things. So that is there. That's kind of the rundown of, most of the file. Other things that I would be looking for, it's not necessarily required to be in the file, but if you're offering industry-specific or company-specific training, you want to make sure that a copy of those attendance records or training certificates or completion of the training is also stored in the general personnel file. More importantly, annually, there should be harassment and discrimination training conducted with individual signature sheets acknowledging attendance and or completion. Now, again, some states require that it be done annually for all employees. Other states, only require it for managers. But general best practice, and we've said this for years, is at the time of hire, everybody should receive harassment and discrimination training, but then on an annual basis, all employees should also be receiving that as well.
Jamie, before you get it further, we do have a question from a couple slides ago, and it is this the same as the E-Verify and reporting for the state or not?
I'm assuming they're referring to the new hire reporting.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. It is not. E-Verify is, if you're a federal contractor, meaning you have 50 or more employees and $50,000 or more in federal contracts, E-Verify is required by the federal government. If you are not a federal contractor, then E-Verify is actually optional for most employers. So the new hire reporting is completely separate from E-Verify. E-Verify is tied more to the I-9 file that we'll dig into here in just a minute. So that's a good question. Are there any other questions before we move forward, Jessica?
I don't see any other questions.
Okay, great. So also in the general personnel file should be our COBRA notices. If you offer insurance and that employee enrolls in the insurance, they should receive an initial notice upon hire if you're offering that group health. Basically, that initial COBRA notice is saying, look, in the event that you have a qualifying event, your hours of eligibility drop, you separate employment, et cetera, here are your rights under COBRA, the Consolidated Omnibus Reconciliation Act, to continue your healthcare coverage during a qualifying event. Okay, that should also be in the general file. Same thing with insurance enrollment forms. So long as there is no health history or health questionnaire on that enrollment form, that insurance enrollment form can go in the general file. Any other benefit information like short-term or long-term disability, life insurance, retirement, all of those things should be in the general personnel file. Whether they're electing or declining it, you want to make sure that you have all of those forms stored, especially when we're talking about healthcare reform, ACA reporting for large employers that have 50 or more. You're gonna want to see a form that says I either elect coverage and here's how much my premium is, or I'm declining coverage because I have coverage elsewhere. Okay. So those insurance enrollment forms are also really important for the file. In terms of the performance management section, I'm looking for performance reviews, the 30-day, 90-day, annual, thereafter. Did the manager sign it? Did the employee sign it? Is there a self-evaluation? I always recommend that self-evaluations are part of that process. We are looking for coaching notes, verbal and written disciplinary notes. Why? Because if you're handing me a terminated employee file, I'm going to be looking for the paper trail. Why were they terminated? Were they given various coaching opportunities and write-ups? And do those write-ups support the separation documentation, right? So just some tips here on your verbal and written disciplinary notes. Make sure that you're always focusing on fact versus opinion. What was said, what was done, what policy did it violate versus, relying upon opinions on why they did something. One of the other things that I look for in these disciplinary documents is that the manager clearly spelled out what corrective action was going to be taken and by when. The other thing that I'm looking for is if they violate it again, if they do it again, or if they have another disciplinary issue, what are our next steps? That's really important, especially for purposes of unemployment. Making sure that write-up is clear as can be on what happened, how we're going to fix it, and what happens next if we don't. And then I'm looking for the fact that both the employee and the manager signed and dated the write-ups. So I'm looking for performance history as well. Do these write-ups also contradict what the performance review said just 10 days prior? Performance reviews can be a little tricky. They're an art, rather. Some people over-evaluate, some people under-evaluate. And so we're looking to see consistency through the file on making sure that the performance reviews support the actual behaviors, and that the written disciplinary or verbal coaching notes don't contradict what the performance review said, unless there's obviously some sort of justification there. If there are any sort of awards or special achievements, obviously we'd love to see that in the file. Every file should have a new hire checklist, a training checklist as well, for their onboarding, any sort of required training that they need for the company, whether that be safety training, harassment, discrimination, other types of training you may offer. And then generally, I'm also looking for separation of employment information in those terminated files. Going back to state specific, some states require you to do a separate separation notice form, but we always recommend it as best practice anyways. It's an internal form similar to your write-up form that just is, documenting why are they being separated, what happened, were there prior warnings, et cetera, and then the manager and employee sign and date. Exit interviews are really great if you can do them. A word of advice there, though, I wouldn't try to do them after they've left because you'll never get the information back. Assuming it's a good separation of employment, whether somebody's resigning in good terms or what have you, do the exit interview. It can really bring to light some valuable information and feedback for the organization. If the employee was enrolled in your group health, I'm also looking for COBRA election notices and forms. Now, remember, you have 60 days from the qualifying event to send the COBRA information. If you are under 15 employees and you're not subjected to federal COBRA, Please remember that each state has their own quote unquote mini COBRA that applies to smaller employers. You'll still have notices that you have to comply with, but the length of eligibility to elect that state mini COBRA plan is generally speaking is about 12 months. So make sure that you're checking that as well. Any sort of information for rolling over benefits should be in the file. And then final pay, making sure we're also checking your state regulation there. That final paycheck was cut, sent in accordance with the state requirements. So that's a rundown. It's a lot in the general personnel file. You know, I get a lot of questions on how do we structure the file? Can we have separate tabs? Can we have separate folders within it? Listen, there's no right or wrong way there. Organize those files the way that makes sense to you as the HR person. But what I will say is that, you know, don't muddy in the medical stuff. And what I remind managers about is that, you know, some organizations allow managers to keep their own, like, quote unquote manager file with notes on, you know, performance or conversations that they have with employees. And that's totally fine. Not a problem to do that. However, if there is something in that manager file, the original better be in the general personnel file. It can be very challenging to, you know, go into an unemployment hearing or dealing with the EEOC because this person, you know, alleged discrimination, and, you know, the manager's like, oh yeah, I have this in my file, and HR never even knew about it because it wasn't in the main file. So make sure we don't do that. Anything that, you know, is related to employment needs to be in the general personnel file. With separate medical files, I mentioned they need to be in a separate drawer. In a perfect world, I would prefer that they're in a different cabinet if you're keeping physical copies, and they absolutely must be under lock and key. We talked about the results of drug tests. Those need to be in there. And then any other medical information, whether that be FMLA, Americans with Disabilities Act, workers' comp, OSHA exposures, all of that goes into the med file. If I have a doctor's note that says, hey, please excuse Jamie because she had monkeypox or something, or COVID, you know, that doctor's note needs to go in the general or the separate medical file. Okay. Same thing with return to work notes with restrictions. Those go in there as well. So we talk about keeping separate I-9 files. Again, it's the rule of discovery. And this is why I want to keep them separate. Because with the I-9 file, it's either 100% correct or it's 100% wrong. There is no in between. So if, heaven forbid, you have missed a checkbox, or you put the wrong document in the wrong list on accident, or somebody forgot to sign the verification section, it's 100% wrong in the eyes of the USCIS. And it is a $1,000 fine per form that is inaccurate. Okay, so we don't want those floating around in the general personnel file because it's discoverable, right? So keep them separate. You can sort them active versus inactive. Inactive would be considered 1 year post separation. You can destroy them after. And we'll talk more about record keeping here in just a minute. But if you are going to copy the documents that they're presenting, whether it be, you know, birth certificate, social, driver's license, passport, visa, if you're going to make a copy of them, because a lot of companies do, that's totally fine. One, you're not required by law to do it. But two, if you're going to do it, you need to be consistent across the board. And those copies need to stay with the completed form. Don't let them be floating around in the general personnel file. They need to stay with the I-9. Okay. We do a lot of I-9 audits, and here are some common mistakes that we see all of the time. So in the I-9 form, there are 3 sections for dates. The first one is in section 1, and section 1 is where the employee completes their information: name, email address, eligibility to work in the US, address, all of those things. And the employee is supposed to sign and date. The next date is in the certification section on the second page. And that's what the employer fills out, where they are completing the name at the top of page 2 and the immigration status. And then they're doing list A or list B and C. Okay. Below that is a bolded sentence or two that talks about that the individual completing the form has physically observed and reviewed and certified that these documents are legitimate, and then they're supposed to put the date in that they actually certified, right? And then the third date is also in section 2 in the employer section, where I'm putting my name, my title, the company name, et cetera, and I'm signing and dating that I, in fact, did certify these documents. Now, if you ask the USCIS, they want all 3 dates to match, okay? They want section 1, the certification, and the employer date to all match. So in a perfect world, you know, if I'm hiring somebody today, all 3 dates would say August 16th, 22. Okay. Now, the rules around I-9 actually permit that the days must be within 3 days of hire. So let's say that we hire somebody today on the 16th, but I don't actually get to certify their information until Friday, which is the 19th. Well, that's within the 3 days. So section 1, where the employee completed it on the first day of hire, would say August 16th. But then section 2, certification and employer signature date, is going to say the 19th. That's totally fine. Okay. But what's not okay is when those dates are longer than 3 days apart. Okay. We also commonly see the wrong documents in the wrong list. There is a list of acceptable documents with the I-9 form that needs to stay with the I-9 form. It's like page number 3. It's before you get to all of the instructions on the I-9. That needs to stay with it. And then make sure that you're putting the correct document in the correct list. Okay. Common situation that we run across. A common situation that we run across is that inevitably a list A document, generally that's a visa or a passport, that expires, and the employer failed to recertify in section 3, which is at the bottom of page 2. Or the employer didn't understand the recertification process, and they, you know, the employee, their driver's license expired. Let's just use that as an example. And then they recertified the driver's license in section 3, which is unnecessary. Okay. The only time you recertify employment eligibility documents is when list A document expires or my social security card or social security name on my card has changed, because I have legally changed my name due to whatever reason that may be. Okay. So section 3 recertification is either A, wrong, or B, it was unnecessary because the company recertified something that they didn't need to. And then the next common mistake that I see is at the very top of page 2, you have to put your first and your last name. as well as immigration status, which comes from the first section that the employee completed. So those are some common mistakes that we see on the I-9 files. Jessica, did we have a question?
Yes, we do. The question is, do verbal warnings have to be in the employee file, or can a manager just note that and only submit any written warnings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would like to see the managers note that they had the verbal conversation in the file. Even if it's an email to themselves of, hey, I talked to Susie or Johnny or Mary on this day about X, Y, and Z, and here's what we talked about and agreed to. Just so that, again, it's in the file and it helps support if we get to the point of having to do a written, then that manager can reference back, hey, Mary, Susie, Johnny, remember I talked to you verbally on this day about this. So yes, it should be in the file. Doesn't have to necessarily be a formal situation, but I would like to see that documentation there.
Okay, thank you. That's the only question right now.
Awesome. Okay. Records retention. We get a ton of questions all the time about records retention. So let's dig in. OSHA, because I know you all are so thrilled with that. Injury logs must be maintained minimum of 5 years following the injury. 300A logs 5 years after it's reported. Now, if you have an exposure of an employee, your OSHA 300A, the law technically says they can request copies of those medical records from the exposure up to 30 years post-termination. And I always get feedback, and people are like, Jamie, there's no way. 30 years, you're crazy. Well, actually, one of our consultants not too long ago got a call from a client where OSHA was requesting a copy of the exposure medical record from an employee that had not worked there in 25 years. And the company didn't have it. So that was a hot mess express. But please know that OSHA, generally speaking, can ask to see things up to 30 years after it has happened. Okay. Fair Labor Standards Act, that's your wage and hour, your minimum wage, overtime, salary, all those things. Wages, your hours and working conditions, it's 3 years from the last entry. So that's going to be your payroll, your benefits, your trust records, and your sales records. Time cards, schedules, billings is technically under the law 2 years from the last entry. Why is it 2 and 3 years? Because wage and hour division under Department of Labor, if you were to be audited under the FLSA, they're going to request at least the last 2 years of payroll records and time cards and schedules. Okay. Now, if you've been audited before and they're coming back to re-audit and you got dinged the first time, they're going to pull 3 years. So that's why the records retention there is set the way it is. With Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, your non-discrimination, EEO, and affirmative action records are 1 year post-employment action or after an EEO charge of discrimination. So if you are a federal contractor and you are required to have an affirmative action plan, you need for 2 years to keep all of your employment records, your payroll, job descriptions, union contracts, offer letters, all of these things, okay? So make sure that you have those in place. If you are subjected to the Family Medical Leave Act, you have 3 years to maintain all of those approval notices, letters, requests, dates, and hours that the leave was taken, their benefit information during the leave, including what was paid and what was not paid, etc. Income tax records, 15 years. That would also be any and all payroll and accounting information. And oddly, we get a question about leaving the W-4 in the file. So that W-4 remains in the file and in effect unless the employee asks to change their deductions. But even then, just put the new form in the file. You leave everything there. I-9s, you're going to keep them for 3 years from the date that they're hired, or 1 year after they have separated from the employer, whichever is longer. Just forget about the 3 years. It's 1 year post termination. Okay. Again, if you have federal contracts, you may be subject to the Davis-Bacon Act, which deals with prevailing wage ranges. So you're going to be looking at 3 years to include all of your contracts obtained, to your prevailing wages, and hours paid to those contractors. Okay. ERISA deals with your retirement and your pension and your records benefits. That's 6 years records retention there. Questions about records retention before we move on?
Yeah, Jamie, we do have a question on the I-9 section, just asking for some clarification. Are you saying that if a passport expires over time, the employer needs to be tracking the expiration date to rectify the I-9 once it expires by looking at the new passport or different forms of identification presented and recording it in section 2?
Yes. If the passport, which is a List A document, expires, you are required under federal law to recertify their eligibility to work in the United States. That could be that they're giving you a new passport, or they may choose to give you a List B or C document. When that occurs, you recertify in section 3 of the form. Okay, so that's a good question. Any other questions?
Don't see any right now.
Awesome. Let's talk about onboarding. So with all of these documents that we have to have in play, it's the first couple of days, I feel like, when you bring in a new employee is more of the administrative process, right? But we all know that finding good employees is really, really tough right now in the market, and being able to retain them is also really tough. But it really does start day one from your onboarding process. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing our success. Generally speaking, most employers have a 90-day introductory period where employees are proving themselves, and we're, kind of keeping a watchful eye to, are they going to fit here? Is it going to work? Are they doing a good job, etc. So really, during that introductory period, you should still be onboarding, right? So it's not just, a lot of people feel like the onboarding is just the administrative pieces, and then they plop them into the department or their office, and they're like, great, have at it. But really, that first 6 months can make or break the employee. So you want to make sure that, especially within the first 30, 60, 90 days, we're doing a lot of training, and we're doing roundtable discussions. We have buddied them up. We have set up meetings with key insiders to, help them foster relationships and learn about our business and learn about how we do things. Even the most seasoned career individual who's been in the industry or done whatever role it is they've done for 15, 25, 30 years already, your company still has their own ways of doing things, okay? So you want to make sure that we are acclimating them to our way and what our expectations are. You also want to make sure that we're providing on-the-job learning, and that's supported. That may also include individual mentorship. I'm seeing a lot of organizations move towards more formalized mentoring programs within their organizations as a way to bring additional value personally and professionally to their staff. You also may want to consider job shadowing or product or field experiences like site visits, vendor visits, that sort of thing. Again, you want to make sure that these individuals are as well-rounded as you possibly can. So you have your informal onboarding and your formal onboarding. Obviously, the formal side is the paperwork, the review of the handbook, the policy and the procedures, going through the job description. You know, that piece, HR generally, as well as the manager, will walk through. But the informal onboarding is really where the rubber meets the road. We've got to make sure that they are learning about the company, our jobs, how we do things, what's expected, what works, what doesn't work, what the organizational plan is, because that helps formulate trust, respect, and relationship with that new employee with the rest of the team. Okay. So don't just focus solely on the administrative side, the formal onboarding. Think also about areas of opportunity for the informal onboarding piece. So you've got 4 distinct levels within onboarding. Obviously, you have the lowest level, which is compliance. That's the administrative side. Then we have clarification. Does the employee understand their job and all the expectations? Then we move into our culture, which gives them the sense of formal and informal organizational expectations and norms. And last but not least, we move into that connection piece. That's where we start to see them forming relationships, interpersonal relationships with other employees. Again, that piece is vital for retention. Even in this crazy market, people are still citing the #1 reason for leaving as a lack of connection, whether that be with the manager, the company, coworkers, etc. So relationships still matter. You've got 3 levels of onboarding, whether it be passive, high potential, or proactive. Certainly each level has its own strategy level there. You also are going to want to make sure that there is a formalized onboarding process, and each person that's playing a role in that onboarding process knows what their role is, as well as is kind of checking off to make sure we're staying on track. So you want to make sure that you're getting your return on investment, because you are investing in your people. So what training are they doing? The new manager assimilations, any resource groups that they may be required to participate in, and when. There should be a 30, 60, and 90-day checklist associated with those things. Other short-term outcomes that we look for or suggest is that there are self-efficacy, role clarity, social integration, and knowledge of culture. And these things, these 4 areas really do help employees maximize their onboarding success. Okay, which generally leads to higher job satisfaction, lower turnover, better performance, career effectiveness, overall lower stress. Everybody's happy. We want the long-term outcomes of having a good process, right? We're going to skip that section. So HR should obviously be involved in onboarding with recruiting, the job previews, the orientations. Again, things that I look for in the HR function would be a written onboarding plan. What type of stakeholder meetings are held during that, and if you're using an onboarding online platform, I want to see that as well. All of these things are important to make sure that we have the appropriate support and tools and processes in place. We look for coaching and support, training, and other feedback tools as well. So HR's function is really going to hit all of these areas with onboarding. Your onboarding is obviously going to be slightly different depending on what level of employee you're bringing into the organization. The content may be much different as well. I mean, if you're looking for a chief operations officer, they're going to be meeting with the CEO. They're going to be asking to review financials and other things, but you're not going to give your profit and loss statements to an hourly, receptionist. So you want to make sure that your onboarding is tailored for every type of worker within the organization. So for small to medium-sized organizations, technology can be your friend. So can online onboarding. A lot of these new HRIS systems or payroll systems do have the option to use that. Just make sure that your forms, your policies, your procedures are uploaded appropriately and everything is safeguarded. But, you can utilize this technology. So again, just some best practices, and we've talked a lot about this already. Have a good plan. Make sure that you've got nice milestones, 30 days all the way up to 120 days, that there's accountability there for everybody involved. People are actually following the plan. They're signing off that they've, completed it, etc. So that we are getting our return on investment there. Jessica, any questions about onboarding?
I do not have any questions at this point.
All right, not a problem. Our last section is the importance of the employee handbook. So as a reminder, ACIL members has the ability to send SESCO their handbook and have it reviewed by our employment attorney for both state and federal compliance. And I think that it's a flat fee, I think of like $350. You get a report, you'll get a discounted price if it needs updates because you're an ACIL member. We'll say, look, your discount is this. But just a reminder there that you have that access as a member. The handbook should be a living, breathing document. It is used for both recruitment, it is used in performance management, it is your day-to-day guideline. And it has so many advantages. And I feel like a lot of times it's that one HR system or company system that inevitably kind of falls to the wayside, right? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to have it reviewed and updated annually and that sort of thing. But it also can save you a ton of pain, suffering, and money if it's done right. So, a handbook obviously is going to outline the company, our policies, our procedures. It helps us get credibility so that employees know, hey, here's what's expected of me. If X, Y, and Z happens, here's what management's going to do. Oh, in a perfect world, it's intended to save time and money, okay, and operating costs, because it should be a guide for managers. It's step-by-step process. It also is an important orientation tool, walking through those policies and those procedures. So it has a lot of advantages. From a legal piece as well, certainly we have to have certain policies and procedures in writing under federal law, and those should be in the handbook, whether that be FMLA, ADA, I-9, EEO. All of those things are required by law to be in writing. When does your work week start? That's a 24-hour, 7-day period. When is payday? All of these things are required to be in the handbook. Your benefits, what type of benefits do you offer? At the end of the day, it is your legal defense, right? So if I'm going to let an employee go because they continue to violate the attendance policy or they, engaged in workplace harassment, I'm going to pull the employee handbook. Did they sign for it? First and foremost. Secondly, they did. All of my paper trail and documentation is going to support, look, you violated this policy. I didn't fire you because of whatever reason you're alleging. I fired you because you violated this company policy that you signed for at the time of hire. Okay. So it is a legal defense. It helps support why we do what we do in terms of employment actions taken. It does help the supervisors know what the policies are. It should, in a perfect world, help them apply those consistently day to day, since they have people management responsibility. And it gives common ground for mutual understanding of the employee as well as the manager. Look, attendance is this. Vacation says this. If you have a complaint, the procedure is this. I mean, it really is it's a guidebook. It's the HR guidebook for supervisors who may not be HR experts. So we want to make sure that it's a good compliant manual and it's helpful to them. And then for the employees, certainly it's used in education, orientation. The family members may have questions about benefits. And generally speaking, when I know that there are policies and procedures in place as an employee, that gives me a better self-esteem and job security, knowing, hey, if this happens, this is kind of what the company's take is on it. Okay. So we get a lot of questions on when do we update the handbook. We always recommend that the handbook be reviewed annually because state law changes so often now. It often requires that your handbook policies be updated as well. Federal law doesn't change as frequent as state. So best recommendation is have it reviewed annually, have it reviewed by an employment attorney or SESCO, somebody that works with handbook and policy and employment law procedures. Generally speaking, if something else has changed, like for example, if we have changed our benefits, or some sort of other significant change has occurred, you're obviously going to need to update the handbook. When laws change, you have to update the handbook. If you become unionized, you have to update the handbook. Okay. You also want to be mindful of certain language that constitutes or would be considered as a quote unquote binding contract. Remember, most states are at will, meaning they can quit with or without notice, with or without reason, and or they can be let go with or without notice and without reason. So we don't want to have any sort of language in the handbook that implies or that would violate at will status. So here's just some examples of phrases that we try to avoid. Just cause. We don't use the term probationary period. We use it, we like to call it introductory period. And again, some of these suggestions are because of the way the National Labor Relations Board has interpreted certain things, as well as the Defense Trade Secrets Act. Certain continuous opinion letters require, changes under both those regs require employers to tweak the language in their handbook as well. So you may or may not have a robust company structure, but let's talk about an employee handbook committee. And it doesn't have to be a committee, but generally speaking, there's going to be somebody within the organization that is primarily responsible for this handbook. Could be your HR person, could be the CEO, could be the office manager. But it's always nice to have a couple of pair of eyes on it as well. And so when we do reviews and engage in updates, there needs to be a primary point of contact that is working alongside the attorney and or SESCO to walk through the handbook development checklist. What's included, what's excluded, what needs to change. It's not uncommon for clients to say, well, I don't want that in the handbook. And then I have to be the bearer of bad news and tell them, well, you don't really have a choice. The law says you have to have it in there. So you want somebody that's kind of communicating rather with the expert to make sure that we are getting the appropriate updates. That point of contact is also going to be looking at the drafts, the redlined tracked changes drafts, making sure that the edits were made, any questions are being asked, if a policy was flagged for consideration, that they're looking at that. They also should be involving other managers in the review. Extra eyes are never a bad thing, especially if we have managers that are like, providing feedback on, should we include this? I don't really like that. It's a team effort, for lack of a better phrase. It is not uncommon for a handbook, whether it be undergoing just changes or we're creating it from scratch for you all. It's gonna go through multiple draft revisions. Heck, the law could change in the middle of a draft revision, and then we have to add another draft. So don't panic, but most of the time it's about 4 revisions before the final copy is ready. Working through that we are dotting all of our I's, crossing our T's, it's proofread, we've removed all edits and red lines and that sort of thing before that final draft is ready to be print and distributed. Now, you can some companies still like printing hard copies, and that's great. And other people upload that through their HIRS system or email it out and allow for electronic signature. That's also great. However you want to distribute that is fine. Here are some things that should be covered in the employee handbook: any personnel policy, employee benefits, working conditions, your pay systems, disciplinary or progressive disciplinary procedures, work rules as well. Anything, we get a lot of questions about, should I have a manager only handbook? And the answer to that is no. We don't recommend that you do a separate manager handbook because that creates this weird culture where employees feel like it's us versus them. But B, the manager should be held to the same standard as well in terms of general personnel policies and procedures. So you don't want to have any special employee benefit sections, anything that's going to be changing regularly. I also don't recommend including names of specific individuals. Sometimes we see handbooks where, let's just use the safety section, for example. If you have a safety concern, please contact Rob Smith at this extension because he's a safety officer. Well, what happens if Rob Smith isn't the safety officer anymore? Maybe he retired. Then you have to update the whole handbook and redistribute. So, don't use specific names of people. You can certainly use titles, for contact information. You also want to make sure that if you do have a collective bargaining agreement in place with a union, that handbook employee language is not conflicting with our current labor agreement there. So when you roll it out, I personally recommend rolling it out, setting up meetings to walk through, what the changes have been, what are important reminders, and then being able to answer any questions. You can do that first and foremost with the managers, so everybody's on the same page there, and then you roll it out to the employees. Also, during the new hire and onboarding process, you should walk through all of that with the employee as well. So we covered a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm more than happy to share the PowerPoint with Jessica and she can get that to you all. But do we have any questions about HR systems and onboarding or anything HR related that I would be able to address for you?
Again, if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box. There's a chat icon located at the top right-hand side of your screen. I'm looking right now, and it does not look like we have any questions at this point, but we'll give it just another minute or so, see if we can get some questions in. In the meantime, Jamie, thank you for your presentation. As always, it was very informative.
Oh, you are so welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
And yeah, if you can get those slides to us, we will put them on the website with this presentation, and that would be great.
You got it.
Okay. I do not see any other questions at this point. So with that, I think we will go ahead and conclude. Thank you all for your participation today, and we look forward to everyone joining us on our next ACIL webinar.